The birth of a king was meant to save an empire. Instead, it sealed its doom. Madrid, 1661. The royal palace trembled beneath the weight of prayers and fear. Candles flickered along marble corridors as the scent of incense thickened the air. Behind the heavy oak doors of the queen's chamber, screams broke the silence like thunder. Servants moved in panic, whispering prayers they no longer believed in. Then, suddenly, the noise stopped. The silence that followed felt heavier than any cry. The door opened. A midwife appeared, pale and shaking, her hands soaked in blood. She did not bow, did not smile, did not speak the words everyone waited to hear. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "He's not right." Inside the room, Queen Mariana of Austria lay unconscious, her face drained of life, and beside her, wrapped in gold silk, lay the child who would one day be called Charles II. His jaw hung low, his tongue too large for his mouth, his body weak and still. He could not suckle, he could not cry. Yet courtiers bowed before him, their eyes full of dread disguised as devotion. They called him His Catholic Majesty, as if a title could hide the truth. Trumpets echoed across Madrid, celebrating what should have been a miracle. But in that chamber, where incense tried to bury the smell of blood, a different story was written. The empire had not gained a future. It had given birth to its curse. That night, Spain did not welcome a savior. It welcomed a curse wearing a crown. And the world would soon learn what happens when blood becomes its own poison. Stay with us. Subscribe and witness how the most powerful dynasty in Europe slowly destroyed itself from within. Centuries before the birth of Charles, the House of Habsburg had already written its curse into flesh. Power was not enough for them. They wanted purity, a kind of divine perfection they believed could be protected by blood alone. To marry outside their line was to risk corruption. So they turned inward. Cousins married cousins. Uncles took nieces as wives. Generation after generation folded into itself until the royal family tree no longer reached for the sky but coiled upon itself like a serpent, devouring its own tail. They called it loyalty to heritage, devotion to divine right, a sacred duty to keep their blood untouched. But behind the golden crowns and painted portraits, the serpent was tightening its grip. The faces of the Habsburgs began to repeat themselves, the same heavy jaw, the same swollen tongue, the same tired eyes that could not fully open. It was not a symbol of nobility. It was a warning that no one dared to speak aloud. Courtiers whispered about it only behind closed doors. They said the Habsburg jaw was both a mark of pride and a prophecy of decay. Doctors of the court noticed what priests would not name: mouths that could not close, jaws that grew until eating became painful. Words came out broken, thickened by tongues too large for speech. Yet portraits of these kings and queens continued to present perfection. Every brushstroke lied to history. Behind each painted smile was a face that could barely swallow. Among the ancestors of Queen Mariana stood Joanna of Austria, whose portrait was said to haunt the palace. Her features were both familiar and grotesque, as if painted through a distorted mirror. Her likeness hung beside her relatives, each one looking more like the next, until the Hall of Ancestors resembled an echo chamber of the same blood calling to itself. The Habsburgs did not see the danger in their reflection. They saw continuity, they saw control. They mistook illness for holiness. By the 17th century, the dynasty had reached a point where the blood that bound them had become their greatest enemy. The Spanish and Austrian branches intertwined so tightly that the empire itself was trapped within the veins of a single family. Documents from the time spoke proudly of unity, but the truth behind those alliances was darker. Every union was another turn of the serpent's coil, another step toward suffocation. When Philip IV ascended the throne, the pattern continued. His advisors urged him to look outside the family for a bride. He refused. Instead, he chose his niece, Mariana of Austria, a girl already carrying the blood of the same line that had built his crown. Their shared ancestry was so close that some said they resembled reflections of each other more than husband and wife. The court celebrated the match as divine providence. The church blessed it as proof of royal sanctity. But behind the celebration lingered the same silent fear. They were not creating new life. They were replicating old mistakes. Letters written by foreign ambassadors spoke in coded language, calling the match both sacred and strange. One described it as a marriage meant to preserve a kingdom, but destined to destroy it. Even the artists tasked with immortalizing their faces hesitated. How could they paint beauty when the truth stared back at them from every line of the jaw and every shadow beneath the eyes? Still, the ceremony went on. The serpent tightened again, and within a few short years, Mariana carried the child who would bear the full weight of centuries. The whispers grew louder as her belly swelled. Some said the queen glowed with divine favor. Others said the glow was only the reflection of a fire that had been burning too long within the blood of her ancestors. The courtiers prayed for a healthy heir, unaware that the prayer itself was already too late. The curse had already chosen its vessel. In her womb, centuries of pride gathered to create one life that would end them all. At 4 years old, Charles II had already been proclaimed King of Spain. The crown that once belonged to Philip IV now rested upon a child who could barely lift his head. Inside the golden halls of the Alcazar Palace, the air shimmered with incense and silence. Servants moved like shadows, wiping the drool from the small boy's mouth and calling him Majesty with trembling voices. He sat propped in cushions of silk, his body fragile, his gaze unfocused, his tongue too large for words. Each breath seemed borrowed. Each movement looked like pain disguised as ritual. Yet every morning, courtiers bowed before him as if before a miracle. The empire had placed its faith in a body too weak to bear it. They dressed him in velvet trimmed with silver and whispered prayers that no longer sounded like belief. To the world beyond the palace gates, he was His Catholic Majesty, the chosen child of heaven. Inside those walls, he was only Charles, a boy trapped in silence. The nurses fed him slowly, spoon by spoon, his lips trembling to swallow. When he tried to speak, the words came broken, thick with effort. Still, the court called his silence holy. They said the stillness in his eyes was wisdom beyond his years. Painters were summoned to transform frailty into glory. They painted Charles II tall and steady, with clear eyes and calm dignity. They hid the swollen jaw, the slack mouth, the drooping head. In oil and color he became a king, though in life he could barely stand. When foreign envoys arrived, the illusion was rehearsed. The young monarch was seated upright, his face powdered to hide the gray pallor, his clothes perfumed with amber. The music began. Courtiers bowed, and the kingdom convinced itself for another day that heaven had not turned away. One French ambassador recorded what others dared not write. He said the king seemed more like a creature preserved by divine accident than a ruler ordained by God. The word spread in whispers and then vanished under fear. Truth was dangerous in Madrid, in the palace of El Escorial. Silence was the first commandment. Behind the child's fragile figure stood Queen Mariana of Austria, the true hand that guided Spain. She ruled in her son's name, signed decrees with his seal, and kept his weakness hidden behind the veil of sanctity. Courtiers learned to obey her as they pretended to serve him. Ministers knelt before the queen, priests praised her devotion, and the empire turned into a theater of obedience. Charles II became a symbol, a living mask that covered the exhaustion of a dying crown. When he appeared in public, the people cheered as if faith could erase fear. His pale face trembled under the weight of jewels. His head tilted as the crown slipped sideways. The crowd shouted blessings. The priests raised their hands, and the deception endured. Every ceremony was a prayer to keep decay unseen. Every smile was a curtain hiding despair. Inside the palace, the nights grew heavier. The child king still breathed, but each breath sounded like the echo of something ending. Spain had placed eternity in the hands of a boy who could not hold it. Charles II lived, but his breath already carried the scent of ruin. The boy was breathing, but the empire had already stopped. The royal court of Spain had become a theater. Every corridor echoed with rehearsed laughter. Every gesture performed for survival. Ministers bowed with hollow grace, their smiles polished and empty. The air was heavy with perfume and fear. In the center of this grand illusion sat King Charles II, a boy grown into a man whose body still betrayed him. His skin was pale as wax. His hands trembled against the armrest of his chair. Yet courtiers treated him as if he were made of gold. They called him sacred, not because they believed, but because belief had become a command. The throne room glittered under candlelight. Each flame mirrored 100 times on the polished marble floors. But behind that brightness was a stillness that felt like death. Orders were spoken, but they meant nothing. Decrees were signed, but everyone knew the ink carried no power. The government functioned like a ghost, walking through the ruins of its own body. And Charles II, frail and silent, was the holy relic that justified the ritual. Whenever the king appeared in public, the crowd knelt. His figure was carried through the streets in a golden litter, wrapped in silk and jewels. His head tilted to one side. People whispered prayers as if he were a saint rather than a sovereign. Children were lifted onto shoulders to see the miracle of his survival. But the closer they looked, the harder it was to deny that the miracle was only a mask. His lips barely moved. His eyes blinked without focus. His breath shallow like a dying candle. When illness struck him, as it often did, panic spread through Madrid. The priests filled the palace with incense, their chants rising through the corridors. Nobles whispered of curses and spells. Some claimed that witches from the south had placed a mark upon his blood. Others said the devil himself had found a throne in Spain. Each rumor replaced reason, for reason no longer served the empire. Doctors arrived in endless procession, armed with relics and powders, each promising salvation. They cut, bled, prayed, and failed. When their treatments worsened his pain, they called it divine testing. When his fever broke for a day, they declared it a miracle. Nothing was ever learned, only repeated. The court clung to superstition because truth had long been exiled. Inside the palace, Queen Mariana moved like a shadow between rooms, ordering more candles, more prayers, more silence. She spoke of faith, but her eyes betrayed exhaustion. She knew that the boy who had once been her justification was now her burden. Still, she could not stop the play. No one could. Every minister, every bishop, every servant was trapped in the same performance. To admit that the king was dying would be to confess that Spain itself had died long ago. The grand halls of El Escorial no longer echoed with the voice of empire. Instead, there was the sound of shuffling feet, of priests muttering beneath their breath, of courtiers rehearsing lines of devotion they no longer believed. The portraits of former kings looked down in silence, their painted eyes witnessing the collapse of everything their blood had built. Each morning, the bells rang as if for celebration. Each evening, they tolled like mourning. The difference between life and death had blurred into ceremony. No one dared to speak of it, yet everyone felt it. The empire moved, but only out of habit. The throne stood, but it no longer ruled. The king lived, but he was no longer alive. It was not a court anymore. It was a funeral that never ended. When Charles II turned 18, the court decided that a wife might save what remained of the dynasty. They chose Marie Louise d'Orléans, niece of Louis XIV of France, a girl of 17 whose beauty was spoken of like sunlight. She crossed the Pyrenees to meet a husband she had never seen, a man already whispered about in Europe as both king and curse. The wedding was magnificent. Trumpets echoed through Madrid, church bells rang, and nobles bowed before the young couple as if heaven itself had blessed their union. But behind the celebration lay a silence no music could cover. On their wedding night, Marie Louise entered the royal chamber trembling. The candles flickered against the walls, the air thick with the scent of incense and fear. Charles sat on the edge of the bed, pale and wide-eyed, dressed in silk heavy enough to crush him. The girl tried to smile. He tried to speak. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Some said she wept. Others said he prayed. No one knew what truly happened behind the doors of that room, only that the night ended with confusion rather than union. Days turned into months, and months into years. No child was born. Priests offered blessings. Doctors mixed powders of pearls and crushed insects. Healers whispered that the moon might cure the king's affliction. Nothing changed. The queen grew pale. Her laughter faded from the corridors. She rode her horse through the gardens to escape the suffocating stillness of the palace. But the eyes of the court followed her everywhere, measuring her failure. She was 26 when she died, officially of illness, though everyone in Madrid knew it was of despair. When they placed her coffin in the chapel, Charles threw himself upon it, sobbing until his voice broke. He begged to be buried beside her. He said that her spirit would return if he waited. For days, he refused to eat. The courtiers stood in silence, afraid to touch him, afraid to speak. When he was finally led away, the echo of his grief lingered like a curse that would not lift. The ministers spoke again of marriage. Spain needed an heir. The empire could not rest its fate on mourning. In 1690, they found another bride, Maria Anna of Neuburg, sister to the Queen of Portugal, known for her intelligence and will. She arrived in Madrid with an army of priests, healers, and midwives. The court whispered that she would succeed where the French princess had failed. She smiled politely, but her eyes showed that she already understood the truth. The second marriage brought no miracle. Charles grew weaker, his body swollen and exhausted. Maria Anna watched him with the patience of a nurse and the resignation of a prisoner. The palace filled again with the sound of rituals. Holy water was sprinkled on the king's bed. Charms were hung from the windows. Sorcerers were summoned in secret to break invisible spells. They burned herbs, chanted verses, and declared that the king's suffering came from witchcraft. The queen followed every instruction, desperate to please God or fate or anything that would make her husband whole. But nothing changed. Outside, famine spread across Spain. Inside, the royal court worshipped shadows. Every breath Charles took was treated as divine proof that heaven still favored them. Yet everyone knew the truth that no prayer could fix the body that carried 2 centuries of pride. Each queen arrived as a promise and left as a ghost. By his mid-30s, Charles II was no longer a man, but a ruin carried from room to room. His body failed piece by piece. His skin had turned the color of parchment. His hair came out in handfuls, and his eyes sank deep into his skull. Every breath was a labor. His veins thickened. His blood moved slow and heavy, and his limbs swelled until he could no longer stand. The empire that had once stretched across oceans now hung on the shallow rhythm of his breathing. Each morning the servants entered his chamber quietly, their faces expressionless. They lifted him from the damp sheets and washed his skin with rose water to hide the smell. They dressed him in heavy velvet and fastened the gold chain across his chest. Then they placed the crown upon his trembling head and called it a miracle that he still lived. Courtiers bowed as if holiness had returned to Spain, though everyone knew they were bowing to habit, not faith. In the chapel, candles flickered across his hollow face. Priests read prayers that had lost their meaning. The choir sang, but even the hymns sounded tired. When the incense grew thick, the king's head lolled to one side, and attendants stepped forward to steady him. The court spoke of divine endurance. The silence of heaven became their only answer. Outside the palace, reason was dying with him. Physicians whispered their doubts but dared not speak aloud. They prescribed powders made of pearls and gold dust, believing that wealth itself might heal the body of a king. When his stomach bloated, they called it divine mystery. When he collapsed, they said he was being tested by God. Science existed only as rumor, buried beneath centuries of superstition. Inside the walls of El Escorial, time moved differently. The air felt heavy, as if the building itself refused to breathe. Queen Maria Anna watched her husband fade, her face unreadable, her lips pressed tight to keep from speaking the truth. She had ruled through him for years, and now she ruled through his decay. Every day she stood by the bed, while ministers whispered of succession in the next room. No one dared to decide the future until the past had stopped breathing. The king's body continued its quiet rebellion. His joints stiffened, his teeth loosened, his vision blurred. He spoke less and less, his words reduced to murmurs. Servants fed him broth through silver spoons and wiped the corners of his mouth with cloths soaked in wine. His reflection was hidden from him, the mirrors in his chamber covered by order of the priests. They said a man so close to death should not face himself. Outside his window, Spain was breaking apart. The fields lay barren. The people starved. Ships that once brought gold from the New World now returned empty. Yet inside the palace, the rituals went on. Bells rang, candles burned, decrees were signed by hands that could no longer hold a pen. The empire had become what its king had always been, too weak to die, too broken to live. The priests still prayed, but their words fell into silence. No exorcism could cure what centuries of arrogance had written into the bones of one man. Charles II was no victim of spells. He was the consequence of power that refused to change, of blood that had forgotten how to renew itself. He was not bewitched. He was the curse itself. By the winter of 1700, King Charles II was no longer a man, but a husk collapsing in slow motion. His body weighed barely 45 kilograms. His skin had turned the color of candle wax, thin and brittle, stretched over the outline of bone. His hair fell in clumps. His eyes dulled to the gray of dying embers. The blood inside him had thickened, black and heavy, moving sluggishly through veins that could no longer carry life. His belly swelled while his limbs shrank. His breath rattled against the silence. The scent of decay filled the royal chamber, even as attendants burned herbs and incense to disguise it. He lay upon a bed of velvet, surrounded by priests, courtiers, and candles that had already burned too long. The prayers were soft, mechanical, empty. The courtiers stood in formation like statues, their faces expressionless. No one dared speak of hope. Hope had left this palace years ago. The crown rested nearby on a silk cushion, its gold dulled by the smoke that thickened the air. The man who had once carried it could no longer lift his own head. There were no heirs, no sons, no future. The great line of Spain's Habsburgs ended in that room. Charles II, called the Catholic Majesty, died without faith, without strength, without anyone left to carry his name. His life had been a ceremony, his death only the final act. When his chest stopped rising, no cry broke the silence. The courtiers bowed as if it were part of the ritual, as though they had been rehearsing it all their lives. The priests crossed themselves. The servants extinguished the candles. The empire that once ruled the world now knelt before its own emptiness. Outside, the bells of Madrid began to toll. Across Europe, armies were already marching. The death of Charles II ended a dynasty and began a war. The War of Spanish Succession would turn kingdoms against one another, devouring everything his family had built. In the end, his legacy was not power or glory, but proof of how both can destroy those who worship them too long. He was not the fall of Spain, he was its reflection. The night swallowed the sound of the bells, the candles melted into darkness, and upon the dais of the royal chamber, the throne stood empty beneath the fading light. If stories like this remind you how power devours itself, stay with us, subscribe to our channel, and witness how history bleeds behind every crown.